Hey, good morning. Boker Tov. We have to stop reading the Bible as though it's literally true. Hey, what's up? I'm Adam. I want to talk a little bit about a Jewish take on a story that we read this week in the Jewish tradition. This comes from a couple of places. I wanted to talk about this because it's really interesting and I think it's instructive and informative. And if you're into sort of this like biblical criticism, here's a good story that we can learn from. But I also think it's a good example for those who would use the words of the Bible to critique the Bible. I'm with you. Reading the Bible as though it is seeking itself to be a history book or seeking for itself to be true or seeking for itself to have one perspective. These are errors. These are mistakes. Now, these are mistakes that have made them way into or made their way into like fundamentalist interpretations of the text. This is not to throw shade or to pick on anybody, but I think especially within conservative Christianity, evangelical Christianity, there is an inclination toward reading the surface level of the text as somehow true, literally true, or something like this. That is mistaken. That's a mistake. That's something that we ought not do. The text never says for itself that it's seeking to be read in that way. In fact, the most ancient material in the text is poetry. And I think we can agree that poetry is not a medium that seeks for itself to be literally true of the world in the way that a historical account might seek for itself to be. So there's no evidence within the text itself to suggest that the authors of the text were intending to write these things to be literally true accounts of the world. And so on, however you sort of fall out on that debate, whether you're somebody who takes themselves to be religious, takes themselves to be someone who is like Bible believing or followers of the Bible or something like this. I want to talk a little bit from a Jewish perspective here, and I want to lift up a story that we read yesterday, I suppose, because it's Sunday, Boker Tov, Shavua Tov, we're in a new week now. But every Shabbat, Friday night into Saturday, there's a reading of Torah, or as the first 5 books of the Christian Old Testament. And those are assigned weekly, sometimes two. But essentially in a year, you'll read all of Torah. Is just sort of a practice that some people do. Now, this isn't totally foreign. Like for Christians, your congregation might follow the Revised Common Lectionary, for example, which also, that's a triannual reading cycle, but also divides up text, and the sort of the community rallies around that and reads it together. So there are these portions, Torah portions of Parsha, that are assigned within Jewish communities that, you essentially read one, sometimes two, weekly. So I want to use yesterday's example. I think it's going to be really interesting. Here's a critique that I continue to hear, is that, people talk about, how ridiculous the Bible is. But it's the people that are talking about how ridiculous it is are often reading the text on the page as though the text on the page is the text on the page, as though that was the intent. That's what the intended meaning is. It's supposed to be read at a surface level. There's not much else going on. I saw a creator make a video, and this is what kind of motivated me. I was thinking about making a video like this, but then I saw a creator earlier make a video about talking about how, women have childbirth because they ate an apple and a snake talked to them and stuff, and isn't that ridiculous, and why would we pay any attention to that, and that's the reason not to pay attention to it. Yeah, man, here's what I want to say first of all, is like, you're assuming that the Genesis account was written like last year, and they chose to ignore the evidence of fertilization and zygotes or something like this. Keep in mind, this is thousands of years old material. We didn't even do hand washing before surgery until Semmelweis in 1847. So let's not, first of all, let's not imagine that any of these ancient authors like really thought that pain in childbirth came from an apple and a snake or something like this. It's just ridiculous to read the text in that way, and it's ridiculous to ascribe that belief to the authors of the text. Who are we to infer that the authors of the text really believe themselves to be providing an account of physiology and biology and medicine? There is much more happening, and it's always funny to me, it's interesting to me how like so many of us are willing to like extract meaning from movies that we know aren't the case. But then we always want to read the Bible as though it's like literally and factually true and then dismiss it on those grounds. It's just mistaken. Moreover, I think the problem here is that people often approach the Bible like they were taught Romeo and Juliet, but nobody taught them about Shakespeare. And no, I don't mean Shakespeare is God in this comparison. Shakespeare is a man, and there were men who wrote the text. Maybe a couple of women in some instances, but mostly men. And so let's not read Romeo and Juliet without studying Shakespeare. Let's not read the Bible without studying the authors behind the text. Okay, so there's just some things to just put on the table in 4.5 minutes. Now let me pivot to this story before I go too long. So yesterday, the assigned reading was about Phineas, like Phineas and Ferb, not really about Pinchas. It's about this character who was a religious zealot. Now, in the bounds of the story, not what really happened factually in the world, I'm just saying within the story itself. The thing is that there's some fraternizing between the people of Israel, ancient Israel. This isn't modern nation state stuff, ancient Israel. And there's this Midianite who draws this ancient Israel group to worship Baal Peor, another god, idolatry, no bueno, violation of the covenant with the God of Israel, and ushers on a 45-day plague. Well, Pinchas, this individual who's a religious zealot, carries out an act of religious zealotry, an act of violence, and for that act of zealotry is rewarded with a covenant of peace. And so if you're reading the surface text there, it seems to endorse this act of zealotry, which is not good. We do not want religious extremism. As we're living through religious extremism in America right now, this is not a thing that we want to endorse. And so what might be said about it? Well, if you're reading the surface level of the text, you're sort of trapped into this sort of view. Is there more going on? Well, when we zoom out and we think about who actually wrote the text, when we look at the text through the lens of not like, let's treat it as true, but let's treat it as people wrote this story. Why did they write it? What motivation would they have? What is internally consistent and inconsistent in this story? Well, the tribe that leads these people to Baal Peor, to this idol worshiping, they're from the tribe of Midian. It's a Midianite person. Well, gee, it seems strange to kill a Midianite. I'm sorry. I'm trying to avoid the words for the censors. Rats. It seems strange to have an act of religious zealotry against a Midianite and that to be celebrated because Moses, who's taken to be one of the central characters of Torah, of the Christian Old Testament, of the Bible, Moses indeed is married to a Midianite. So that seems wonky, right? Why would you celebrate that act of zealotry against the same tribe that is connected to one of the principal religious heroes, okay? So that seems like something could be going on. There's an endorsement of Aaron, who's purportedly Moses' brother, and by brother we probably mean just from the same tribe. But see, there's a difference in the way that the practice carries out over time. Some people align themselves to Aaron. Some people align themselves to Moses. We see that in the southern writings of ancient Israel, there's more of an inclination toward Aaron. We see in the northern writings of ancient Israel, there's more of an inclination toward Moses. And so here we see the act of zealotry against a Midianite and an affirmation of Eleazar, son of Aaron. So we see an affirmation of the Aaronid line, and we see criticism against Midianite. So those are two kind of overt things that would speak against Moses. Now, the Aaronid line shows up in the south, the Moshite line shows up in the north. And so what we start to see when we uncover the sources and the context of what's happening is we see an affirmation of the Aaronid priestly line, and we see sort of shade and criticism thrown to the Moshite line. So lifting up the southern writings, criticizing the northern writings. So what on the surface reads like a story of religious zealotry, actually under the hood here could be an affirmation of one priestly line at the expense of another priestly line. Now that's really interesting stuff, and that's a much better way to read that story than the surface level that's like, oh, well, religious zealotry is authorized and licensed because of this story. It's the wrong way to read the story. So the lesson here is we just got to stop reading the text as though the text takes itself to be historical documents. We got to understand who wrote it. So this is largely a priestly account. The priestly source is one of the main four sources in the construction of the Torah. There's also the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, the priestly source. There's a redactor that puts it together. The priestly source is obsessed with covenant and ritual. So another great example that in this story, we would expect there to be religious zealotry. We would expect there to be a defense of the covenant. We would expect there to be a defense of what the priests do and their core beliefs. So all of those sources have to be brought to bear on the interpretation of these texts. And I thought yesterday's, this Parsha, Pinchas, was such a good example of how all those sources come together under the surface of the text to give a much more compelling narrative than just a simple surface reading. So stop reading the text of the Bible as though it intends for itself to be literally true. It does not.